This week we're looking at W.T. Stace, The Concept of Morals, just the first chapter, Chapter 1, Ethical Relativity 1. This is kind of an essay unto itself, is about ethical absolutism, what Stace calls ethical absolutism or moral absolutism on the one hand, and ethical relativity, which is, I would say, the same as what we've been talking about in terms of moral relativism. Ethical relativity, moral relativism, to me are interchangeable, and I'll use them interchangeably without even thinking about it. And how does he first characterize the difference between these two things in a very interesting way? He makes an analogy with politics and says that ethical absolutism is right-wing and conservative, and ethical relativity is left-wing and radical. And that's very interesting, I think, and is a way of characterizing perhaps what was happening in his time in early 20th century. And I think that that way of thinking about it is probably still somewhat valid. That is, ethical absolutism is old-fashioned and conservative and represents traditional ways of thinking. And those who defend it are probably thinking in, the traditionalism and conservatism and old-fashioned ways are good, and they might be right. And those who propose the contradictory view of ethical relativity or moral relativism or ethical relativism, however you want to put it, are those who are the people who are trying to knock down tradition, point out the flaws in tradition, point out the danger of clinging to kind of a traditional way of thinking about things for its own sake, and that just as in other areas of human thought, the humanities and the sciences, mathematics, new ways of thinking oftentimes are better. And that there are challenges to be made to the old ways of thinking, and if the old ways of thinking can't come up with a rational defense of themselves, then they should be discarded. And they might be right too. That's just a way of that, right versus left or conservative versus radical or liberal, however you want to put it. It's just a way of conceiving of things and is not to be taken too seriously. I think Stace would agree. But this chapter is really about what these different positions on the nature of morality or the nature of ethics really are, and looking at what the options are and looking at what the strengths and weaknesses of the various positions are. And there's no clear winner here, although in a larger scheme of things, Stace calls himself kind of relativist, but he has big problems with the relativisms that he discovers in the world. But we won't be reading. We might read a little bit of the book later, but we won't be reading the whole book, so we won't get his whole thesis. But this is very good, I think, this chapter in outlining just what the fundamental choices are in how we regard the nature of morality. What does it mean to be, first of all, as he goes into it, an ethical absolutist, a moral absolutist? And why the choice of the term absolutism or absolutist wasn't really in terms of truth, right? That is, the notion is that the truth of morality, whatever it may turn out to be, is an absolute truth. One might say a universal truth, a common truth, that there is one moral truth in the universe, at least for human beings, and that is binding upon all human beings. He says on page 1, in the beginning of the second paragraph, according to the absolutist, there is but one eternally true and valid moral code. This moral code applies with rigid impartiality to all men, to all human beings. What is a duty for me must likewise be a duty for you. So that's a basic position, that is, that there's one morality, at least for human beings, and in some philosophers' minds, for all possible rational creatures at least. There's got to be one and only one moral truth, at least in its fundamentals. And that's the kind of distinction we'll be getting into later. So right away, though, Stace points out something that's maybe a little surprising. That keep in mind that what it means for Stace, at least, to be an ethical absolutist, to be committed to this idea that there is one and only one moral truth for human beings. The same moral duties, therefore, are binding on all human beings. But he says on page 2 at the bottom, The ethical absolutist recognizes as a fact that moral customs and moral ideas differ from country to country and from age to age. Now, how can you believe both those things at the same time? That is, how can you believe that there is but one moral truth and recognize what Stace thinks is obvious and probably is obvious? That is, that notions of what is morally true have changed over history and are different across cultures. In the way that Ruth Benedict argued in Anthropology and the Abnormal last week, that we see the widest differentiation or differences between cultures in terms of what is regarded as normal, and therefore in her terms what is regarded as moral, and this served as, it seemed, adequate evidence to conclude that there was no such thing as one moral truth. That to believe that would probably be a kind of cultural imperialism, right? The notion that we, our culture, has discovered what is morally right and wrong, and everyone else is somehow crazy, or at least in error, and that would be a form of blindness, right, in her mind. But Stace doesn't see the two beliefs to be incompatible at all. But how can one believe both things at the same time? He continues, this variability, seems manifest and not to be disputed. We think slavery morally wrong. The Greeks thought it morally unobjectionable, and that's not quite true. I mean, some Greeks thought it morally objectionable, but they were definitely a tiny minority, I think. The inhabitants of New Guinea certainly have very different moral ideas from ours, but the fact that the Greeks or the inhabitants of New Guinea think something right does not make it right, even for them. Nor does the fact that we think the same things wrong make them wrong. They are in themselves either right or wrong. And that's a very important distinction, and kind of solves, at least in Stace's mind, the, on the face of it, contradiction between the two beliefs. That is, one can certainly recognize that moral beliefs across cultures can be radically different. But all that means is that people thought differently. It didn't mean that the reality of what is right and wrong was different for them. Now, how can that be? Well, he compares situation to situation of science through history, or people's beliefs about nature, basically. He continues on top page 3. What we have to do is discover which they are. That is, if things are right or wrong. What anyone thinks makes no difference. It is here just as it is in matters of physical science. We believe the Earth to be a globe. Our ancestors may have thought it flat. This does not show that it was flat and is now a globe. What it shows is that men, having in other ages been ignorant about the shape of the Earth, have now learned the truth. So if the Greeks thought slavery morally legitimate, this does not indicate that it was for them, and in that age morally legitimate, but rather that they were ignorant of the truth of the matter. Now that's a very, on the face of it again, strong argument, compelling argument at least, from Stace. Now, I don't know, I've always been skeptical that people really believe that the Earth was flat. I mean, if you read ancient Greek scientific and mathematical writings, they knew that the Earth assumed that it was curved, and they actually thought it was a perfect globe, which it's not. They at least knew it wasn't flat. So other examples could have been given. Certainly, educated people before the European Renaissance pretty much believed that the Earth was stationary and that all the heavenly bodies moved around it in perfect circles. And it was Copernicus and others, gradually through the first centuries of modern science, who established beyond a doubt that that was mistaken. So it's just another example. And what does that mean? Does that mean that the Earth was stationary before whatever time in the 15th century when Copernicus published on the revolution of the heavenly spheres? No. It means that they were wrong then, and that we're probably right, at least in our basic assumptions about the Earth being in motion around the sun and not, at least not being stationary, not being at rest in the center of the universe. That's a pretty, so what is Stace saying? Well, the ethical absolutist says, well, the truth is one. It doesn't mean that what people think is the truth is always the same, and because people can think anything, but the truth is out there. X-Files say, waiting to be discovered in morality, just as it was waiting to be discovered in natural science in terms of the nature of the Earth, whether it was flat or whether it was round. And that if people think differently, that's evidence that somebody's got to be wrong. Maybe everybody's wrong. But if people have different ideas of what is morally true that are irreconcilable and clearly contradictory, that doesn't mean that there's two moral realities or multiple moral realities. It means that there's one moral reality and at least somebody is wrong about it. Just as there aren't two physical realities, one in which the Earth is flat and the other in which it's a globe. If those beliefs coincide or coexist, it means that somebody has got to be wrong. So, on the face of it, maybe those ideas seem irreconcilable. That is, that one can be committed to the idea that there's one moral truth and also recognize that there are various ideas of what that truth is across cultures. But it turns out, Stace, not to be strange at all that one can believe both things. He makes another strong point about ethical absolutism on page 3, or points out some of the conceptual ramifications. Second paragraph, he says, the ethical absolutist is not, indeed, committed to the opinion that his own or our own moral code is the true one. And that, that may be a little surprising too. That is, one can be an ethical absolutist and not believe that one has the ethical truth. Remember, to be an ethical absolutist is just to be committed to the bare conceptual claim that the moral truth is the same for all human beings. According to Stace, it does not mean that one thereby logically is committed to the idea that one's own moral beliefs represent that moral truth. That is, one can be skeptical about one's own moral beliefs. Now, this is a very complicated matter, and we will definitely be getting into subjects like this in more detail and questioning this in the future of this course. But again, I think Stace has a pretty strong point here, that just because we believe there is one moral truth does not make us believe that we have it or that our culture has it, which is an interesting point against Benedict from Anthropology and the Abnormal, who seemed to equate the idea that there was one moral truth with the idea that we had it. And Stace is denying that. So, as he says, you don't really have to be a cultural conservative to be a moral absolutist. One may say that a communist, a committed communist, is a kind of a moral absolutist too, believing that there are certain, if one believes that there are certain moral practices and ideas associated with communism, as long as you believe that there's only one moral truth for everybody, you're a moral ethical absolutist. So he has some interesting things to say about that, and also, I think, and maybe we can talk about this in class further, the psychological reasons that people find ethical absolutism congenial, or they may just assume it. And he has some very interesting things to say, not so much in defense of ethical absolutism, but to explain why, at least until recently, everybody seemingly was an ethical absolutist. And I think he basically says that it's the role of religion, especially Christianity. If we regard European and American civilization as being essentially Christian in character, but the notion that there was one moral truth was held up, psychologically at least, by the assumption that that moral truth was represented by Christianity. And that the foundations of morality were religious foundations, that ultimately the principles of morality were dictated by the will of God, sort of Ten Commandments style. If one believes that, then one naturally is an ethical absolutist. And even if you're not a believing Christian, or certainly the Jewish religion and Muslim religion could very well be substitute here. Even if one is not a committed believer within those cultures, that's the culture in which you grew up. So even if you're an atheist, that does not mean that you're not affected by it. So again, we'll have more to say about that in class. Well, in the next video, I'd like to talk about what is really the subject of this chapter, and that is in contrast to and defining itself in opposition to ethical absolutism, the real subject of the chapter, which is ethical relativity or moral relativism.